Supabase is kind of maybe focused on it's easy to scale. It's easy to start off with, like, I don't know that much maybe about Postgres, or like I don't know that much about VMs or about compute instances. So I just want to start to build, and then I can use the Supabase dashboard to look at my query performance, to look at my database performance, and then maybe I don't even actually need to kind of physically scale up my compute. I could then just optimize it a little bit more here, and then I can move up through the compute instances.
Hey buddy, welcome back to another episode of How AI is Built. Today we have a very special guest. Christopher Williams is a solutions architect at Supabase. He has seen all the ins and outs of how developers waste time implementing the same backend components for every project instead of focusing on what really makes your app or your AI special. Supabase delivers the power to build a robust backend in minutes, letting you build better apps faster.
It's essentially like the optimal Postgres stack to give you kind of a backend out of the box. So tooling on top of the Postgres database to give you things like an auto-generating REST API based on your database schema, real-time connectivity with the database so that you can push database changes to clients for things like chat applications, and authentication as well, which is a big one. And then also storage for things that don't belong in the database, but you still need.
Yeah. And especially for me, the user interface around Supabase makes it so easy to work with. Like you automatically have like all the admin dashboards, the connections, also like table viewers, which are underestimated and most of the time, because in most other applications, you have to set up your own admin dashboards to just view and query the tables and to execute SQL in like an interface. Where did your Supabase journey get started, and how have you seen like Supabase evolving over the years?
Yeah, my Supabase journey started maybe like a lot of people during the pandemic. I work with a charity in Switzerland called Women Plus Plus, and we were switching from like in-person workshops to doing remote sessions, and we wanted tools to help teach these skills. And Supabase had kind of been mentioned quite a lot on Hack and Use. So we tried it out, basically setting up Supabase and then having like participants in these sessions using it, and it became super easy. And then I started using it in pet projects. And then, towards the end of the year before last, I reached out to work there. Kind of timing didn't work out super well, and I joined in the summer of last year.
Yeah. And looking at Supabase, in most managed services or also open source database systems, you have a few components. I think Supabase adds on top of that you have a few dashboards and additional things. If you would have to break down Supabase into the different components like storage, query execution engine, what would the components be for Supabase, which are most important to the end user and the developer?
Go true. It's the most important, maybe without people realizing it so much. That's the authentication system that's used. So this is the thing that lets you easily kind of set up Facebook login, Google login, and those kind of things. Then there's Postgres, which is difficult to get specific search results for. And it's Postgres with T on the end. So, and that's the REST server. So this is what generates API endpoints based on your database schema. Those two are kind of the primary. On top of that, then we have our connection pooler. So that's the thing that kind of helps you scale without having to scale up compute. And that's Supervisor, that was launched last year and went properly into production earlier this year. And then we have the real-time server, which was kind of the core, the tool that started Supabase. Basically, that was what Koppel, the CEO, started building when he realized that Firebase had some limitations. And then, then we have the storage server on top.
Yeah, nice. Can you maybe double click on the real-time server? What exactly does it do? How does it work? And what is it used for? Like, what are the use cases where you need that?
So Postgres does replication, two types of replication, but essentially what the real-time server does is it listens for database changes, and then it kind of pushes them out to subscribers, let's say clients, so that you can select tables that might be more active or the things that you're interested in. So let's say you have a chat application, you've got a users table and you have a messages table. You might not be that interested in changes in the user table, but the messages one is pretty important. So you can enable real-time for there. And then the real-time server then receives these changes from Postgres as they come in. It can be all of the changes or just insert statements. And then it pushes them out to clients that have then subscribed to that.
Yeah. And one common thing I see around it is if you have like multiple devices from the same user which can use the same service. So for example, in WhatsApp, that you have a phone which you're chatting with, but also your desktop device, and you want that synchronized so the user can actually switch back and forth and he sees like the current messages. How is it implemented below the hood? Is it a CDC basically that's pushing to the different areas, or how exactly is it working?
Yeah, essentially the replication in Postgres happens such that when a change happens, the real-time server is able to pick that up and it will send it to anything that's subscribed. So that individual user could be subscribed on all 3 devices that they have or just on 1 device, but it plugs in to kind of one of the core features of Supabase, which is row-level security. So this is kind of a feature built into Postgres that lets you specify permissions on a table based on a set of policies. So in this case, when you're pushing out these changes, they're being sent according to those RLS policies. So like users aren't notified about their own updates, their own messages, those kind of things.
Yeah, and this probably isn't like so relevant in the like real B2C case, but often in B2B when you have different users which have access, for example, to a client database, and they only are allowed to see certain clients which fall into their responsibilities. So they are only allowed to see those rows which are from their own clients, but not from the clients of different or other people. And I think like there are 2 different systems within Supabase. One is like more the pull-based systems, where you basically have all the Postgres, more of the API, where you actually query the database and get the data out. And one more the push-based systems, where you actually push changing data to the clients or whatever subscribes to it. And do you have maybe like examples what you have worked on of what you have implemented, like use cases for like one for the pull base and one for the push base to make it a little bit more tangible?
Yeah. One of the components I didn't mention is edge functions, partly because it feels a bit like a standalone product, even though it is integrated. It's not all the time that I'm using it, but I guess the example use case is that I moved from Switzerland to Finland. I wanted to try and learn more Finnish. In my case, then I had a simple application that I would add an article URL, something from Hacker News or whatever else, and on every insert to that article's table, an edge function would run and it would extract the content from the web page, and then it would get a Finnish translation, and then it would process that translation and then show the finished article, but with random words changed from English to Finnish. And then I would get a notification that had been updated, which I could then kind of click on, and then I'd view the article. So it's the aim of, I really want to read this thing, but I also kind of want to learn some Finnish at least at the same time. So I needed it to be kind of quick, but not just copy pasting stuff all the time. Kind of worked like a read it later application for Finnish learning. Yeah.
Nice. And I think there is one plugin or extension. I know that there's something very similar. I'm not sure. It has as a logo some kind of bird. I can send it to you afterwards.
That's Toucan.
It's Toucan.
Yeah, it was bought by Babbel. I promise you, I've tried them all. Partly Finnish is just not a popular language for these tools as well. So that's a setback. For German, there were more options. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is something that could be pretty easily done with LLMs nowadays, because you like one-to-one translation, even in low resource languages, often it's good enough, especially for most of the European ones. And if you're looking at different projects, what are the characteristics that of Supabase that really lead to a user in the end adopting it?
You mean like the killer feature kind of thing?
Yeah, like the killer feature.
It definitely varies based on like the technical maybe level or kind of what people are looking for. Like some people it's the CLI of this is just incredibly simple to kind of spin up a project and I get a local development environment on my own system that's then kind of synced with the cloud, the hosted Supabase. But I think for people that are kind of they're looking to build rather than necessarily about like they're not focused on the technical aspects, that they want a product that helps them build something fast and helps scale, then normally it's things around authentication or the like the extension ecosystem, I guess, that it's easy just to turn on PG Vector, or it's easy to set up like timed jobs to repeat with PG cron and those kind of things.
Yeah, and especially like if I'm looking at Supabase, I'm setting up a system at the moment where I have to go with a cloud provider, which basically has all the functionalities Supabase has basically inbuilt, and it's so many different components I'm building on Google Cloud. It's like so many different components which I have to connect together, and only because I have to place it into a VPC, I have to build it completely on my own. how does it especially compare when I'm looking at scaling? Because for most people, it's probably best to go with a managed service. Also, if I'm deploying on Amazon or Google, in most cases, a managed SQL is the best option, or a managed document store like MongoDB, Atlas. How does Supabase compare, like scaling wise, from especially like the effort on the side of the developer, but also in terms of read write throughput performance?
Well, maybe one of the key reasons that I continued using Supabase was because of the it's just Postgres rule, and if Supabase ever shut down, then I can still just run it on a Raspberry Pi or something or whatever else. But Supabase in the cloud is essentially using just the EC2 instances on AWS. So the performance is as good as each of those levels, right? And we have then attached like NVMe disks for high I/O. Comparison with other Postgres providers is difficult as well because you've got Google Cloud SQL, which is a great product, and then you've got AlloyDB, which is not really Postgres, but it's Postgres compatible. That it's kind of forked Postgres a little bit, and equally the AWS RDS, which could be seen as a competitor, but we actually work pretty closely with that team as well. And then equally on top of that, you have Aurora, which is again, it's not necessarily Postgres, but kind of is. So comparison is difficult. I think Supabase is kind of maybe focused on it's easy to scale. It's easy to start off with, like, I don't know that much maybe about Postgres, or like, I don't know that much about VMs or about compute instances. So I just want to start to build. And then I can use the Supabase dashboard to look at my query performance, to look at my database performance. And then maybe I don't even actually need to kind of physically scale up my compute. I could then just optimize it a little bit more here. And then I can move up through the compute instances.
Where do you think is the point where Supabase, where the simplicity breaks down, where I actually have to go and implement something from scratch or something custom? So looking at especially stuff like the types of documents I'm storing, like document format, the size of the rows, so large text data, large embeddings, or just large amounts of data, but also the usage patterns. So is it something when I'm having like a distributed user base across the globe, is there some point where Supabase actually breaks?
Breaks is a
Strong word.
Yeah, it's a strong word, but it's a valid point. And it's, I think, in my view, at least, like, I think anything that I could do with Postgres, I can do with Supabase. And if I couldn't do that in the cloud version, then I could do it with the self-hosted. I think it's less about maybe what you're doing with the database, rather about kind of your requirements around it. So any number of companies that are like zero downtime is an absolute requirement for us. So even then options like AWS RDS are not viable. So then you do need to use something like a full HA solution that the Supabase does not have yet. So I think that's potentially where it does fall away. You could also say like there is a limit to the size of Supabase's compute, but honestly, if your database needs more than 250 gigs of RAM, then there's other problems to be looking at. I don't think that's a Supabase problem. That's a database problem potentially. Yeah.
Okay, nice. And looking at the steps you actually see customers go through, like the steps in the customer journey of adopting Supabase, like most people will probably just start out, they're opening up their project and they are using mostly like the Python and JavaScript libraries for just the ease of it. What are the first real like optimization in performance that people should do before actually like scaling up the compute? Especially looking at like query performance, configuration performance, like what are the different things that are really, really fast and the more obvious things to do?
I think that for sure, those are kind of, they're not quick wins because they are also scary things, particularly if you've built a product and now it's kind of in production. And then somebody says, oh, you should probably consider changing your indexes. And that seems like, does that mean it's going to lock my table? Like, am I going to have to go down for some hours? I don't know what partitioning is. And that just sounds scary. Like those kind of things is a tough. But I think the Supabase dashboard has, under like the logs and the metrics and the reports, then there's insights there into like slow queries. On top of that, the Supabase CLI has an awesome command called inspect, and you can just ask it, give me the output of the calls to the database. And you can see, like, I've made 4 million calls just to this one query, and that's maybe problematic. But you can also see indexes that you've made that aren't being used. And you can also see query plans that are then being logged that potentially taking too long to execute. And I will say one thing that's normally overlooked is the RLS policies that you set themselves. It's easy to make them complicated to fit all of your use cases, but that will also then slow it down. It's basically asking to do two queries, the query you want to perform and then the RLS query at the same time. So I definitely would start there for debugging. If I'm looking at problems and I've maybe got more than like 10 or 15 policies set up, then I would start looking there.
Yeah, so basically try simplicity first in the row level security, and then try to really focus on the query optimizations you can do. Is there an advantage of doing the query in SQL over using the Python and JavaScript libraries?
That is a good question. And I'm pretty sure it would be almost like a 50-50 split if you asked kind of people within the team or even the community. I think Postgres is awesome. Massive props to Steve, who actually was kind of hired by Supabase to continue working on Postgres. I think it's an amazing tool. I think it fits so many use cases. And when it doesn't fit, you can also just tell it to run a function. So you could write your own SQL function and then still have it called through Postgres. But yes, there are times when I see a Postgres kind of call logged and you think, okay, that's maybe not, it's not optimal for that use case. And it's difficult to make a tool that will then fit for every situation. And I'm also biased. My personal preference is just to write it in SQL. But I've also done that for 15 years. So maybe that's different. I think at 20, if I could have just made an HTTPS call to Postgres or MySQL, I would have done it. In fact, I did, like when Mongo launched. That was amazing to me.
Yeah, and I think for most, especially AI people, it's easier to do it in pure Python than to write or to start to write SQL queries, because there are a bunch of things you can do wrong, which really leads to bad performance. Because so many people I see are just like doing select star, get everything out, which is like the worst practice you can do because you're reading so much and most of the time you don't need it. And it's like, I'm also still stuck. I prefer, for example, really polars and pandas, like the data frames over like doing SQL queries, because it's just like, it fits more in the mind frame and mindset of the AI people. You already mentioned PG Vector. How, because the extension seemed to have appeared suddenly out of nowhere, because I've never seen PG Vector before, like I think 2021. Do you know how PG Vector actually got started and when it got started? And did it exist before actually the whole LLM and RAG use cases popped up?
I don't know its like full origin story, but yeah, it definitely existed before because its use case was also for things like kind of recommendation engines or like similarity searches. So things like similar to maybe what products like Algolia do or something. So like you've got some documents, user enters the search term, how alike are those kind of things. But yeah, definitely around the LLM burst, I think that was, yeah, its number of installs spiked, and I'm sure its number of issues opened and pull requests made also probably spiked towards the start of last year.
Yeah, and looking at PG Vector, do you have in mind, like, of course it has the storage component, but for vector search to work, you need way more. You often need indices. You also need the search components. How does PG Vector actually work below the hood, and what are the components which the extension brings with it to Postgres?
Yeah, I think for Postgres, essentially an extension is a set of C files and SQL as well. So in some ways it's quite simple, and in other ways it's quite complex, especially if Postgres SQL and kind of one of the more older kind of system languages is not in the skill set. But what PG Vector brings is a data type for things like embeddings and for vectors, I guess let's call them what it calls them. So it's essentially just an array of points that can be used for embeddings. On top of the data type, I guess what it really offers is the different kind of search functions that you would typically be using in like a machine learning type environment. So like nearest neighbor searches, like similarity searches, those kind of things, calculating like Euclidean distance or whatever else. After the kind of LLM boom happened, having the additional index type, this HNSW, I think that's kind of what really unlocked it for those features, made it a lot more suitable for also performant, but of course a lot more suitable for a wider range of LLM applications. It was incredibly good for those things, but not like its initial intended use case, maybe.
Yeah. And always when I'm thinking about especially embeddings, it's about the index and also the rate of computation, because I've worked, for example, with LANs where you actually have to manually, you are recomputing the index. And most often you're doing it based on like a refresh rate. So basically every 20,000 new rows, you say like, okay, I'm recomputing the index. This isn't done in Postgres, because Postgres also, like, the index recomputations are mostly like abstracted away from the user. You're setting an index, and on insert, Postgres is mostly handling the work of indexing the new rows which are coming in. For people who don't know it, an index is basically, for me, it's a pointer to basically enable faster search to point to locations where the actually data is stored. How does PG Vector handle that? Because index computations for embeddings is way more compute intensive than index computation, for example, for a regular search column with categories, for example.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's, while it does, PG Vector then makes Postgres as a database like a lot more accessible for those kind of use cases. It doesn't just do it out of the box, I guess, and that's maybe where it's harder also for people that are self-hosting, or they're kind of running Postgres on their Mac through Homebrew or Docker or whatever else. But when you install PG Vector, it's out of the box. It's not necessarily going to work. And that's not just because maybe PG Vector needs some configurations, like how you configured your indexes, which index you're even going to use, but also Postgres might want some tweaking, I guess. I don't know if that answers it that much. Or...
Yeah, so for PG Vector to work, it's more set up in the end than if you go with a regular vector database. But I like it more because using Postgres as a vector database, or just as a general database, gives you way more powers in the end to use the other feature a full-fledged database comes with, what most vector databases don't have yet. And that's stuff like just filtering based on datetimes, which nearly no vector database has yet. So in all, I'm using Unix timestamps or something similar to filter based on the time, which is really impractical. If you're looking at the larger extension space, what are for you the most interesting extensions you've seen, especially looking at AI use cases like model training, data analysis, where you typically have more like columnar storage or distributed serving even?
Yeah, for columnar storage, I think it is definitely super interesting. Timescale like led the way for that as well, and changes with licenses have also kind of made it harder to use with Postgres. Seeing newer entries like Hydra is a fairly highly requested extension for Supabase for Postgres. Yeah, that's definitely an interesting one to me. For me, I'm also interested in not just the extensions like Hydra or PG Vector, also things like pgcron I think are incredibly useful, even for trivial things like maybe running kind of cleanup tasks or checking the status of the database and getting it to report without having to set up like a full kind of observability, but using things like the foreign data wrappers in order to then connect Postgres into external systems, things that might be like storage systems like S3 or whatever else.
And this basically is, in the end, like a lakehouse. You're using Postgres to query Parquet files, which are which are sitting in your file storage. In data storage, I think it's even worse in AI. There is so much just earned knowledge, like little secrets you just learn over time just through using databases a lot. What are like the configurations and little tricks and hacks you use most often across your different projects?
So logging for sure, that's vital, even if it's just kind of using pSQL or whatever tool you use to connect to the database and just asking it to log everything that you do in that session. So everything that you do while you're connected. I think this is particularly useful. And then for debugging, changing the statement timeouts so that you can allow them to run for like a longer time. This also lets you see like the performance then that's happening on the database. Like, is it just timing out because it needs like 5 minutes to run? Or is it actually timing out because what I've written is just not a performant query, or the way I'm storing data is just not optimal? For the kind of the maybe not AI specific, but I guess index heavy applications, then configuring the maintenance work memory. This is essentially like the memory that's then set aside for Postgres to do things like auto vacuum, index creation, etc. Having it higher, particularly if you've got like an initial bulk, like you want to create an index, like an IVF flat index on some data, then bumping that up, you can always reduce it then afterwards as well. Like if you're not on a particularly powerful box, that's also fine. But setting it to give it that initial boost to allow it to create that index is usually useful. Yeah.
Can you also set the maintenance schedule? Basically, when the database executes it. I just know it from Google Cloud at the moment, because you can basically set a time when Google is allowed to update the databases.
So two things, I guess. So for Postgres, there's an auto vacuum, and this can typically run daily. It can impact performance, but typically doesn't. And then there are the maintenance window, like you mentioned, for Google Cloud or for DigitalOcean or whatever else. And that's normally when, like, if there's been like a security issue that they release a patch for, that they would apply it then, because it would normally mean like taking your database down for 2 or 3 minutes or something. Supabase doesn't have that feature yet. Upgrades are performed kind of manually by the user. So kind of within the Supabase platform, then in the settings, then you can click upgrade and your project gets upgraded, unless it is something critical, and then we do apply them.
Yeah. And especially like the mem cache and the working mem cache is something that you will need to set, especially if you're using embeddings, because you need way more than for a regular index. So what's next for Supabase? What are the interesting stuff you can say which you're working on, or what you already pushed out but most people ignored? I think especially looking at open source projects, they are pushing it out so many different features that there are so many overlooked ones. So what features would you highlight, and what can you tease for the foreseeable future?
I think two to highlight. One is, I'm sure there is a subset of the community or people that are aware of Supabase that know this and love it. But I'm more, like you said, I'm more of a Python developer. I'm more used to the backend. I've worked within the Node ecosystem for sure, but Supabase has the Edge Functions runtime, which is based on Dino, which is different but quite cool. One thing that came out of one of the last launch weeks was the support for NPM packages and the allowance to kind of like run essentially kind of like almost like a full Node API really through these Edge functions, which is cool to have this almost fully serverless kind of backend as a service with very few code changes. It doesn't have to change how I'm used to writing code when working within Node or using NPM. So for me, I found that super cool. It's made Edge functions way more accessible for me, that I'm actively using them in projects where I would have been hesitant to do it before. And the other is foreign data wrappers, because my personal view is I love tracking everything. Like I have data being pulled from everywhere, from like Apple Health, from everything that I'm watching, every 3 minutes, whatever I'm spending on my machines, all of it gets tracked, and not all of it needs to be in the database. Like I particularly care for all the granular information. So storing that in somewhere like S3 and then being able to query that within Postgres, that I still have this like single kind of pane of glass, I guess, to see everything. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, and also from a user perspective, what I often do in projects, because like all the information often isn't that relevant anymore, especially in AI when you're serving it to the users, but it is still interesting for training, so you store it anyhow. But through the foreign data wrappers, you also can come up with some interesting ways where you can add it also to the user application, where you can add like a search on the old data as well, or a chatbot on the new and old data, where you do like a double search in the end, and then you can come into like interesting patterns where you first do like a fast one on the database, a retrieval, and then correct the response based on the additional context you retrieved on the old data, which is pretty interesting. And you can come up with pretty cool patterns using stuff like this. What is something that you're missing from especially like data engineering, data storage, what you would love to see built around Supabase?
Again, like personal opinion, I guess offline first, because I do like to track all of the things, and like I don't necessarily have access to data all the time. So this offline first, the idea that your application is your source of truth and can synchronize with a backend like Postgres. We've got one open source tool, I think PowerSync might also be, but Electric SQL that has launched a beta, I guess, last year, does this, and they work with Supabase to do that, which I think is awesome. And PowerSync, yeah, for me, that would be being able to handle synchronizing data and also like these kind of changing these data migrations, but with the application being the source of truth, rather than having to open up a tool like Obsidian or whatever you use to take notes and you're waiting for it to like pull everything down. It doesn't feel like the future.
So looking at the future, what is actually like when you're looking at AI use cases, it's at the moment it's mostly like RAG and LLMs. What is your dream tech stack, including Supabase, to build out AI use cases?
Okay, so my dream is probably less of like the app, maybe kind of, it's not something that's probably going to make money, but using Supabase with being able to integrate it with Hugging Face as they launched last year was awesome. Like kind of being able to generate these embeddings through an edge function is amazing. For me in the AI space, Olama is like is a life-changing tool to be able to set those things, to make them accessible to users at different technical levels. It's just an API running, so you can download an interface and use it like ChatGPT for people that aren't super technical, or then you can actually start interacting securely and properly with open source models. To see that in secured networks, that for me would be super cool. To fully trust and say, here is all of my data, here is truly everything. It's like full access. That would be awesome.
Yeah. One project I would really recommend you check out is SuperDuperDB. I'm not sure whether you heard of it. And they are basically trying to add AI directly on top of the database. So you basically declare like a field which is computed on through AI based on new inserts. So basically when a new insert's come, the field is computed. But you can also set when a new insert is coming, the entire column is recomputed. And they basically try to really shift the AI to the database. They have a bunch of integrations like on top of MongoDB and on top of regular Postgres. Whether it will work on Supabase, I think it's for you to check out whether it will work. But it's a really interesting project which allows you to do like really cool stuff without really thinking so much for in terms of deployment. And especially if you have to do stuff basically instantly when data is inserted, which often is stuff like embedding calculation, tagging, classification, it's really cool to just add it to your database and not really worry about it, that it's running or deploying extra microservices.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I'd be curious to see, architecturally how it works, if it's like using Postgres triggers for these changes as well. Yeah, thanks. I will check it out.
Nice. So where can people follow along with you and Supabase and stay up to date with all the new developments that are coming out?
I think for Supabase and memes, then the X account, on Twitter, shouldn't call it X. We shouldn't let that name stick. But at Supabase on Twitter, and then we've got the changelog for, at least for me, like the easiest places to see the changelog on GitHub. But we do have the Supabase blog and the changelog there. You can also like bring it into your RSS feed. And obviously we have our launch weeks as well. So next one coming up.
And if people want to get in touch with you, where's the best place?
I do have an X account. Probably LinkedIn, I guess, is the easiest place because that's where like messages show up. Or you can, chris.pub, I guess, is my homepage. It's probably the easiest place to find me.